There will be no systemic or structural change without personal change. That there's no change out there without change in here.
Welcome to The Future We Want, a podcast for rebellious leaders ready to get to work, do the work, and create the future we want. I'm Raphael Bemporad, founding partner of BBMG, a branding and social impact agency that works with leaders that won't wait on things that can't wait. On today's episode, we take a moment to celebrate BBMG's 20th anniversary. And on this very special podcast, I'm delighted to welcome three amazing human beings who have been part of BBMG's journey from the very beginning, and who throughout these many years have been friends, partners, colleagues, mentors, and sources of inspiration and example. So today we're speaking with Lara Galinsky, the founder and CEO of Move the Crowd and author of the spectacular book, The Calling, Coen Gilbert, co-founder of B-Lab, Imperative 21, and White Men for Racial Justice, and Lara Galinsky, founder and social impact strategist of The Genuine, and senior director of impact innovation at Project Liberty. 20 years ago in 2003, my buddy Mitch Baranowski and I created BBMG with the aspiration to make a life and not just a living, as our beloved professor John Rodden taught us. And in our conversation today with Ra and Jay and Lara, you will hear stories from the soul, lessons from lives fully lived, and inspiration to guide our way forward. Welcome to The Future We Want from BBMG. All right. Hey.
Hey.
Well, thank you all so much for being together today. I'm beaming. Coen Gilbert, Lara Galinsky, Lara Galinsky, welcome to the Future We Want podcast. And so much of what we are and what we'll talk about today was truly born in our relationship and in your example. But I want to start with just a big note of appreciation. In many ways, I feel this personally, but I also feel the same for our organization at BBMG, that there is no me without you. There is no BBMG without the three of you. You've been just so foundationally inspirational as colleagues, as friends, as mentors, as examples and models of so much of what we aspire to be at BBMG. And all of us, I think, connected at a moment in the early 2000s. For Lara, we were in the late 1990s working to do something. Lara, I remember you and Cheryl Dorsey at Echoing Green talking about the story of social entrepreneurship, that there are moments in our lives that we experience as these moments of obligation. I think, Ra, you have framed them as moments where we get in touch with our deepest purpose and creativity as a calling. And I'm just curious, in your own lives, what were the moments of obligation that shaped who you are, whether it was a person who mentored you or loved you or supported you, whether it was a experience. But I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about your epiphany moments, your moments of obligation, and how would you describe the sort of, I would say, the calling, the vocational core and truth that you then chose? That's my work, my life, my path.
So the whole phrase of moment of obligation really came from this idea that so many people see the problems in the world, right? We bear witness to it, sort of walking down the street, but we also read about it, and it's in the pain of others. And some people look at those problems, and instead of turning away or feeling a sense of empathy that's fleeting, we lean right into it. And we say, I actually not only believe that I can do something about this, or that this is a problem that is worthy of attention, but I can do something about it. And I'm going to commit. And the commitment, the obligation, is actually to yourself. Yes, it's to the world, but it's actually to yourself, that your life is worthy of something that is more significant than you. And that is, in some ways, the definition of purpose, is that that's what is within you is beyond you, but it comes from within. And so for me, it's actually quite simple. There's lots of kind of mini stories here and there, a parent's example, the schooling that I got. But I would say that that from a very early on, I was one of those people who didn't stop asking the questions of the purpose of life. Right. When kids are 4, it's like the pinnacle of the time where you ask the most questions. And then every year after, it's like less and less and less. It's like sad fact of child development that we start, right, being asked to answer questions as opposed to ask questions. But then we all know that innovation is really about continuing to ask questions. And I would say that one of the questions that I really just continues to perplex me is like, well, okay, I can look at sort of this, all of this as purely through a scientific lens, but actually my deep understanding was that if I was graced with living in this time with these parents, with this circumstance, that how could I not want to be of service? Like to me, it just felt like a knowing that was so deeply entrenched. And so for me, very early on, the place where you did that work was in the nonprofit sector. I don't believe that's true anymore. Actually, I'm really glad that's not true. I'm glad that you can do impact work in so many different ways. And so my pathway started, my moment of obligation really started with identifying organizations that I just viscerally connected to. And so it's always been about kind of this intersection of leadership development and cultural change, and then systems change that has been part of my moment of obligation. And that's, you can connect it to other places in my career.
Thank you, Lara. Ra, what comes to mind for you?
Yeah, it's so beautiful, the synergy, Laura, and what I hear in terms of lineage, because I would say for me as well, with given who my parents were, that was very much deeply embedded in how I came to be. But I think there were 2 moments where for me, this moment of calling, right? I'm going to call it calling, but I recognize obligation in it, certainly given who my parents were. And at 2 different junctures. So the first was, and I've shared about this before, but was being shot at point blank range, and having that outer body spiritual experience where I survived it. And that was that absolute moment of reckoning where, the universe was just like, look, we're done nudging. We're done tapping you on the shoulder. It's time to get gangster. Like you're gonna follow your path, or we're taking you out. We'll just start over. That was a very profound life moment because it was about choosing for me. I so deeply resonate, Lara, with your statement, because I think that anytime we choose a calling, we do choose ourselves. Because what we are willing to say is, I'm willing to surrender to the truth of who I really am, which is what gives us the capacity to really be able to deliver what is uniquely ours to deliver to the world. And I think this correlation between our willingness to embrace, honor, love, and celebrate who we really are, as opposed to fix, transform, conform, contort who we really are in service to success. This is the pathway to a different kind of success, and dare I say, maybe a more rewarding form of success. So that moment for me was a tremendous moment of reckoning and surrendering to the fact that my work is about liberation. My work is about helping to build the capacity for people to come home to the truth of themselves, to be themselves more authentically, and thereby create and deliver on their unique contribution. And that if we could do that in mass, we would really get the world we want. Like we wouldn't just be talking about it. We wouldn't just be paying lip service to it. We would actually get the world we want. And I think the second moment for me was actually, interestingly enough, sitting in a training in Palm Springs. I was getting this very unorthodox business education, spending a lot of time in the human potential world, spending a lot of time in marketing and branding seminars. And I remember a very prominent person walking the stage and was saying what they were saying. And it just, I've been invisible in those rooms for the most part, 2,000, 3,000 people, one of maybe 2 or 3 people of color, certainly maybe one of 2 or 3 artists, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 mission-driven people. Mission-driven people used to get patted on the head in those rooms and asked when they were going to make money. right? So really like fish out of water. But there was a point where I just was like, the knowledge is valuable, but the delivery just does not even begin to see who so many of us are. And I was thinking about my artist friends, my activist friends, my spiritual folks. And I was like, I can do this. I can do this in a way that I actually think could be compelling and relevant for those who I want to serve and could grow their capacity to be of service in the world. And that was really the impetus for founding Move the Crowd. That was the eureka moment for my company. And so that happened 2008-ish, 9-ish, somewhere in there. And I think so much of what we hold in our mission is we are actually reaching for the people that are often overlooked, that may not be as dynamic, charismatic, in front of the room, firecracker, but who have a contribution to make that may not fit in the existing models and that are really trying to figure it out in their own way. And that if they could be supported, if they could be elevated, then all kinds of things would happen. And, so I think about the Gabrielle Bernsteins of the world. I think about the Reshma Sajanis of the world and the ways in which they've built movements that are very unorthodox to what is the sort of typical traditional playbook. I think about Amara Jones, who just made Time Magazine's 100 list, top 100 list for 2023 is one of the most exciting and influential people in the world. She is the leader of the Translash movement. And we're so proud to say that this is one of Amara's homes in terms of leadership and training. So, again, this idea of how do we get outside of the box consistently, even with the best intentions, we still sometimes create new boxes. I say same thing, better branding, right? Raphael, we talk about this all the time, right? But how do we really push that envelope? And so for me, those were those moments of reckoning that I think have really shaped and continue to remind me about why I'm here and what I'm here to do.
I just want to pause for a second and have us take in some of the things that Lara and Ra just said, because there was a lot of amazingness there. And from talking about peak curiosity at 5 years old, I'm gonna remember that for a long time, and figure out how I become 5 again. I think is a big part of my personal quest. And then Ra, you talking about surrendering to the truth of who I am. That is really beautiful. And for someone whose parents gave him a 3 initial name back in 1967 because JFK, RFK, MLK, LBJ, you're going to be president one day. It's going to look good on proclamations when you sign J. Austin Gilbert. Growing up with that implicit, limitless possibility. And what I've only come to realize more consciously, what other people would have said, dude, of course, which is really weighty burden of that kind of expectation. The word surrender is one that I have recoiled from for 55 years because I have interpreted it as a loss of agency and therefore self. And so I am giving myself a little love for not recoiling, but leaning into surrender to the truth of who I am. And I think that's an example of a beautiful breadcrumb that are continually dropped in front of me by teachers like you over the last 20 years. If I can cultivate that curiosity of the 5-year-old that Lara talked about, I can ask myself a deep question who or what am I resisting right now when someone tells me to surrender? And asking myself a question like that is really important because then I could then actually just inquire in a witness kind of mode what it is that I'm resisting. And I can unpack a little bit of the ego and my own sense of self-worth being attached to my productivity and my, things like that. And as opposed to just who I am, as opposed to what I do. And so while I was thinking a lot about this idea of moments of obligation, And I think there's moments of inspiration more along the calling line that I sense from you, Ron. And I tend to more like lean into that energy. But I was trying to think about like the obligation, and probably one of my resistances to obligation is like a resistance to surrender, because it implies that I don't have the choice. I'm being forced to do something, and I'm like, I'm a pretty typical white guy. Like, I don't want to be told to do anything, And but when I think about that word, I was thinking about a moment, and I was thinking about a seed that was planted in a conversation with my dad when he was dying, when I asked him if he had any regrets. And like a good, white dude, he was not one prone to regret. He had a bit of swagger. But he said, yeah, I got one. And I said, well, Pops, what was that? And he said, I sat out the civil rights movement. I don't think my dad and I had ever had a conversation about the civil rights movement, about race, about anything like that. A lot of things, super learned, amazing human being. He'd done a lot of amazing stuff, but I don't think we'd ever really talked about that in any particular way. So I was pretty stunned. And he went on to say, like that was like through the 60s, but by the time, like I mostly remember being consumed in my own little world of starting my business, raising my family, which meant me. And I could see it going on outside my window in New York City, but I was too busy. And that really stuck with me. He was gone a couple of weeks later. And 15 years later, with 13 years of B Corp in between, that seed germinated in a different way when I got cancer and was on one of those pretty long, dark, painful nights, like between like 1 and 4 a.m. when not many people are, even your loved ones who care the most about you aren't around. You're pretty much alone. And thinking about if I was lucky enough to survive, what would I do with that gift? And I thought about, and that's when that conversation with my dad popped up. And I thought about the things that I had been doing and the things I hadn't been doing, the things I had been prioritizing, things I hadn't been prioritizing. And earlier that summer, in the summer of 2016, there was a lot going on in our country. And one of the images that stuck in my mind, if I'm looking for a moment, Raphael, if I'm looking for like, as opposed to like the typical dimmer switch in my life, and more like the lightning bolt. If I were like mining for a lightning bolt, I remember watching a news clip of an early Trump rally when there were still probably 15 Republican primary candidates. And there was a black man in the stands walking up the bleachers, and a white guy in a trucker cap, a couple people in, stepped out of the row and into the aisle and gave the black man like a forearm to the face, which was like startling enough. But what more was a moment that created a moment of obligation for me is he then was interviewed by newscasters right after that, and like proudly stepped into the camera, like pulled up his trucker lid a little bit and like looked into the camera. Was like, oh, I just gave him a little friendly beak in the nose. And I was confronted in that moment with, am I going to be the type of person that is willing to put his body in harm's way for the justice that I say I stand for? Because I believe that time when I saw that happen, I was like, I don't think that's as far away as I would like to believe, either in our future or our past. I think that's actually what's brewing right now. And am I willing to actually put myself in that mix? And so at that moment, and then circling back, and it was a couple months after that I got diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and was in that dark space, and which then brought up for me my dad's one regret when he knew he was going to die. That created a moment of obligation for me that I didn't want to have a conversation with my son or my daughter about any regret of not showing up for the movement of my lifetime. That's what's sitting with me, and why I've been spending more and more time, and as you know, because it's been with you, with this community called White Men for Racial Justice, which is sort of born out of that moment of obligation, not just mine, but hundreds of other men's different versions of that moment of obligation of what am I here for? And am I really willing to stand for it, even when it carries risk?
Jay, thank you. And so much love for what you're sharing. And could you just pull us the thread forward a bit? Because since that moment, it has gotten deeper and more complex and more beautiful in the work that you're holding and carrying. And would you mind just taking us forward to your calling now and the work you're doing inside of WMRJ? And what is that about for you? And what do you believe that's about for all of us?
I thought that movement or that work was about, that racial justice work, that racial equity work was about like creating a just society, a more equitable and just society that was going to be helpful to people that were bearing the heaviest burden of 400 years of injustice and inequity that have compounded generationally. And what I've come to understand better is that it's not only about that. Of course it's about that, but it's also about my own humanity. And Ra has helped me understand that and helped a number of folks in our community understand that. And that this idea of the fractal, and that I've spent much of my life, like most folks who live in their heads in a very analytical, intellectual space, like focus on systemic change and structural change and scaling solutions and moving at the speed, like all of those things that I've been celebrated, rewarded, recognized for, and through the B Corp community or my own business, were actually not serving me very well in this work that I was being called into, because what I have slowly, again, more dimmer switch than lightning bolt recognized, is that there will be no systemic or structural change without personal change. That there's no change out there without change in here. There's nothing that I can do externally in any meaningful, credible, or sustained way if I'm not doing the work internally. And what that has meant for me is I've seen incredible power from myself, and I've watched literally hundreds of other men try to understand not just the history or the neuroscience or the data or whatever, because those things are useful and they help in certain ways bring us into a conversation or check some credibility markers or some credentialing markers. But until I was willing to do the internal reflection to say, where do I show up in that narrative? Where has the accidental truth of my birth, that I'm socially identified as white, how has that whiteness shown up in my life? Until I was able to do that internal reflective work and then be willing to share some of what I've uncovered with that, with other men, women, et cetera, and then listen to their stories of that, it was all quite arm's distance. And if it's arm's distance, it's something that's more easily put down when it's inconvenient or you feel too busy or the risks are too high or it gets too hot. But when I've understood myself in this work and watched other people see themselves in this story, it's much more hard to put down. And one of the guys in our community said, it's gotten to a point where now it is more physically painful for me to not do the work than to do the work. Because for most guys, it's really uncomfortable. Who wants to be in a conversation where you feel like you're being attacked and you feel like you're the problem and you always have been the problem and you're never going to not be the problem and there's no upside for you anywhere? Like, I can understand those feelings. I've had those feelings. And so who wants to go there? But there's a certain line that has been crossed, which says, oh, it's now more painful for me not to go there. And part of that is not just because the work is so you see the inequities more clearly, but it's also because you realize how much joy there is in the work. like, and how much beautiful connection and community and love and relationship that's come out of this work, not only with the other white guys that are in it, but with our sisters and Black and brown brothers and family members that are holding us accountable and in relationship with us. Like, we are now in a different quality of relationship with ourselves and with each other than we've ever been in our lives. And I've heard that from literally scores and scores and dozens, hundreds of men. And so for me, like, the biggest breadcrumbs have been around make it personal, and don't think of that as making it smaller. It's actually a portal to the biggest change you can make, because it's what's going to sustain you in the long run. Because what it's going to build is community, and ultimately community is the only special sauce we've got.
Amen, Jay. And having had the great honor of being part of the community that you've helped to create and steward, I just want to underscore that, like, through the threshold barriers of that introspection and that work in context of community, I, speaking from my own experience, have experienced a deeper love that I don't know that I've ever felt whole love like that before. Like, I was just reflecting on your stories, and, my grandparents on my mom's side were socialist activists, labor union organizers. And on my dad's side, he's, of course, a progressive rabbi, but his father was a merchant. And there are all of these sort of contradictions between these values that shaped who I am and what I aspired to become, and these dynamics that just seem to undermine them, to fight against them. And I think, part of my whole reason for being in my calling has been to try to make whole all of these places that are broken. And in my own life, I think, just fully honestly about it, my parents divorced when I was 8. And I just think I internalized the fantasy of every child that it was both your fault, but also that you had this power that you could make it all better and they'd come back together and everything would be okay. And living and making whole, healing to integrity with appreciation for the brokenness. Ra, your work has been always very close to individual and collective liberation, but it has been quite beautiful and powerful that our paths have crossed again inside of what Jay's describing. And I am curious, with your work with Move the Crowd, with information, with Wide Awakening, what's pulling your energy forward right now?
I'm so moved right now. I just want to say that. And just thank you, Jay, because I really do feel, and you, Raphael, as well, just the courage of being willing to stay in the work, to really allow the work to deliver. And we're talking about it in the context of racial justice and equity, but I want to say that really that's everywhere. That everywhere, very capable leadership is bumping up against itself, and it doesn't see it. It can't realize it. It can't get out of its own way to deliver on what it is that they're trying to deliver on. And it is because we've lived in a society that historically has undermined this work, if we're honest, and with good reason, right? But I do think that the work is love. And I say it, I know it's provocative to say in certain rooms. I'm okay with that. But I believe that the greatest liberation is when we come home to ourselves, is when we recognize that we are human and we are divine. And we do have this interconnected family and community that we've been separated from for all sorts of reasons and agendas, right? The two things that I believe we are healing as humanity are scarcity and separation. This unending not enough conversation and this unending belief that somehow what happens in my world has nothing to do with what happens in yours. And they are both bold-faced lies. And so however we enter into the work, And wherever those moments of obligation or calling or inspiration live, and I have such an appreciation, Lara, too, now for that other part of the question, given what Jay has shared, right? Because certainly I could talk a lot about George Floyd, as I'm sure everybody in this room could. I don't think anybody, if you had any semblance of awareness, I don't think anybody can say that they sort of just stepped over that moment and kept it pushing. So, I love this term, Raphael, healing to integrity, and what the gift of that is when we can do that, and if we can do that, that we are our greatest enemy when we don't, that we're our greatest enemy. As much as we want to point fingers and create sides. And for me, just coming back from the Middle East, I took a delegation of leaders to the Middle East. We just returned a few weeks ago. And we had this experience. We were in the Lemon Valley, which is the central part of the West Bank, just outside of Ramallah in Abud. And we were walking down this dirt road. We were walking the Abraham Path. And we were walking down this dirt road, and there were these shepherds, these modern day shepherds moving on both sides. We had one young man who had about 150 goats, and another man on the other side of young man on the other side of him who had about 150 sheep. And we're just, all you're seeing is this majestic, you're in a valley, you're just surrounded by mountains, and all you're hearing are goats and sheep. And it's just majestic. And we turn into the home of Mustafa and Zain. And they pour us coffee and tea, and they tell us the story of their lives. And it is a story of love. It is a story of occupation. And it is a story of death. And it is a story of rebirth. And the thing that I was most struck by in the midst of that reality was how present and central love was. And we equate usually freedom with mobility, right? Like, if we especially think about it in the context of our Americanness, we just want to move around. We want to go where we want to go. We want to do what we want to do. But how do you remain free when your mobility is challenged? When you're fighting with someone who wants to not only take your water supply, but then force you to ask for permission to actually use your water, right? Like, how do we? And for me, it was a moment of reckoning. It was a moment of inspiration and obligation, because I felt at that point that the ultimate liberation for all of us is to allow love to be bigger than anything. And what does it really take to allow love to be bigger than anything? And for me, they demonstrated that. And I sort of went, well, if they can continue to be love in the face of everything that they're experiencing and sharing, I have no excuse. I have no excuse. And that for me has been now the thing that I'm carrying forward in this next leg of the journey. How to have love be bigger than anything that happens to me, for or against me.
Ra, I'm struck with your stating that using the word love, at least, and then you qualified it and said in certain circles, in certain rooms, might be a little risky. Risk your credibility in a certain room if you put love at the center, let alone make it bigger. And I appreciate that. And there's another 4-letter word that I'm using as like my little sneaky substitute, which is care. And one of the things that I love about that word is it doesn't carry some of that other energy that folks get uncomfortable with around love, but it still carries heart with it. And it still carries connection. And I also, sneaky love that it connects all that to the really sexy work of corporate governance and systems and structures. because the source code of the current economic system is contained in our corporate law, and the source code of that corporate law is the duty of care of the directors and officers of any corporation, anywhere on the planet. Doesn't matter what industry, doesn't matter public or private, doesn't matter how big or small. The duty of care is the legal term. And so I love the fact that, if I say generously, that our beloved lawyer friends planted a seed at the heart of the system that enabled us to walk ourselves back home to care and to think about, to whom do we owe that duty of care? And the current traditional interpretation, legal structure of that, I would say mistakenly, robs us of our freedom to care for the people we most care about, which aren't typically our shareholders, right? Most people don't go to sleep at night and offer a prayer to their shareholders, or think about their last breath and say, if I could only have spent a little bit more time, or done a little bit more, squeezed out a little bit more earnings per share for my shareholders. There's probably other people that come to their mind first for who they care about, but yet the current interpretation of the system is that our duty of care is so narrow that it excludes us. It robs us of our humanity and disconnects us from all the people who we actually care about and all the places that we actually care about. I care about my neighborhood. I care about my neighbors. I care about the tree, like all those things that we care about, my two-leggeds and four-leggeds and no-legged relations. I care about all those folks. And the secret, the key, the key to unlock the door is right where we left it. It's in our duty of care. And we just have to remind ourselves that, of course, that we have an obligation or a duty to care for those whom we're connected to and whom we love. And so I just so appreciate you talking about those four-letter words that are hard to use. And so I am much more receptive to love now than I probably was at other points in my life and career. I'm willing to have that show up in a conversation. And I'd love to add to that this other four-letter word of care and see how it can connect from heart to boardroom.
I think the premise that you shared, Ra, about scarcity and separation and the horizon line over to love and duty of care, they're so in relationship. And William McDonough, one of our friends and mentors who's in the design field, said that Wall Street is, in his belief, simply a whole construct to create the perception of scarcity where there is none. The entire premise of Wall Street is simply to create the perception of scarcity where there is none. And he's a circular designer, so he's thinking about natural systems and how abundance inside of nature is whole. And that we have literally created that construct to shape us. And now we're reminded of your path on the West Bank, Ra, and sitting close to stories of love and loss and occupation and death. And then I think rebirth is such a beautiful place to sit. Lara, as we sort of take in the stories that Ra and Jay are sharing, I'm mindful of your own continuing journey, and in particular, the work you're doing now that is going to call on our humanity in different ways than we've experienced in the past. That the premise of scarcity and separation, the path of love and connection and care is at a precipice moment. And I'm curious if you could just share how you're trying to integrate the Lara Galinsky of do something and echoing green and the genuine, the beautiful way that you've constructed your own path to just help us together confront what's ahead as you think about, obviously in the context of Project Liberty, thinking about the precipice of technology and humanity. Can you just give us a little bit of context of how are you navigating your journey into this space, and what are you holding closest?
Absolutely. I wish and I hope that people can feel the head nodding that is shared in this room as we're all listening to each other, because it's really palpable. And I just feel deeply honored to be live here and listen to y'all's journeys and stories. And there's a lot of resonance. Just to back up a little bit, for me, I started a little bit with talking about moment of obligation. And that led me to try to understand the science of purpose. I'm really interested in human development and child development to adult development. Interestingly enough, adult development is a relatively new field, right? We keep developing until we die. I'm also intrigued by what people say when they die, what they care about, because I feel like that's a huge lesson. And so I think one of you said earlier that, that's all we got, the relationships, and that bears true when you talk to death doulas and hospice workers around what they bear witness when they're working with people who are passing, and how often people call their deceased parents, right? In that moment, those are the relationships, the ties that sustain us somewhere deep inside. For me, when I learned the science of purpose, it was truly like one of those electrical moments where I came to realize that it just had all that ingredients of lineage, right? We're talking a lot about family here today, right? Purpose does get passed on. And sometimes in a way that's not always aligned with people's paths, and other ways that is. So it has to do with the past. It has to do with an aspirational future, right? To what end? But it lives in the present. It lives in the present. And the more I understood the impact of living a purpose-driven life, which I would say for me, ultimately earlier in my career, I had purpose as a capital P. Where I had this idea that you had sort of like a mission. But now, as I've gotten older and I hopefully wiser, I believe purpose lives in actually lots of lowercase p's. And it's really about the small stuff. And the small stuff adds up to the bigger stuff. And the impact that you have in others. Like, purpose-driven people are infectious. They're inspiring. They are the Jay Coens and the Lara Galinsky and the Raphael Bemparads of this world that people want to be around and learn from, and are inspired by, and go to for counsel and for seeking wisdom. And it's also biologically, people who have more purpose in their lives live longer, literally on average 7 years than those who have lower senses of purpose, and better sleep, better relationships, a ward off dementia. So for me, learning all that, I was like, why don't we raise our young with this idea that meaning matters? That to what you're connected to matters, whatever that is. No one should judge what you feel connected to, except that it's bigger than you. And so I created my own enterprise, The Genuine, and my coaching practice, and training and facilitation, with that in mind. Like, how can people who are people developers, broadly defined, how can you bring in an element of purpose through the power of your being, through those small interactions you have with people on the street, to relationships that you have professionally, to how you show up as a leader. And the word "the genuine," I'll just share, comes from Howard Thurman. If those who don't know, a theologian, a mystic, an educator, a philosopher, a civil rights leader, a trailblazer in the interfaith movement, who died in 1981, I believe. And what I love about Howard Thurman, and I've looked at a lot of his work over the years personally, is that during key moments in the civil rights movement, speaking of civil rights movement, Martin Luther King had Howard Thurman's book, Jesus and His Disciples, in his pocket, protesting, just to kind of share the kind of lineage and the history. So Howard Thurman in 1980 was the baccalaureate address at Spelman College, just a year before he died. And he delivered what I think is one of the most beautiful baccalaureate addresses or speeches that I have ever heard. And the word, the genuine, comes from that. And so I'll just share a few of those words from Howard Thurman because it really inspires me and carries me to where I am now. And I'll get to the tech in a moment. But he said, there is something in every one of you that waits, listens for the sound of the genuine in you. And if you cannot hear it, you will never find whatever it is for which you have been searching. And if you do not hear it and then do not follow it, it was better that you have never been born. You are the only you that has ever lived. Your idiom is the only idiom of its kind in all of existence. And if you cannot hear the sound of the genuine in you, you will all of your life spend your days at the ends of strings that someone else pulls. The sound of the genuine is flowing through you. Do not be deceived and thrown off by all the noises that are part, even of your dreams, your ambitions, so that if you do not hear the sound of the genuine in you, because that's the only true guide that you will ever have. And if you do not have that, you do not have a thing. That has carried me, those words. And then it continues on from there. This idea of what I think Jay and Ra have talked about, which is like, what do you believe in? Who are you? And that can evolve, right? That can evolve as you have kids, as people around you die, as world events, as cultural changes. And as that evolves, how does that guide allow you to shape your life, allow you to make the decisions, allow you to show up in the ways that you show up, in the way that Ra and Jay and you, Raphael, have shown up? And so for me, I have gone from path to path, really in more, I would say, of an organic openness to that which is in front of me. And so what I've discovered is that I can't do one thing, that I have to have a portfolio model. So that's why I show up as a coach, as a board member. I have built communities of coaches that I love to be part of, that are just really outside the system, right? Of something of like an informal infrastructure. I really like decentralized communities. And, but also I've heeded the call of different organizational missions. And the latest organizational mission that I'm working on behalf of and honored to be part of is really around how does technology shape our lives? How is it helping humanity thrive? And how is it really negatively affecting and perpetuating inequities and significant, deeply entrenched challenges? And with a particular look at social media and a particular look at even just the business model of technology and the impacts on our attention, the impacts on kind of like our identity. And I mean that because we have these things called digital identities, and it really kind of shapes us to where we get our information, what we believe about the world, to AI and all the conversations about generative AI, from the existential to even just thinking about misinformation and what's real and what's not real. So there's so many things around our current relationship with technology that we need to acknowledge. We need to acknowledge, and we need to think about what is the responsible path forward. And so the organization that I'm working on behalf of Project Liberty right now is trying to build a thriving, responsible technology ecosystem that looks at it from the business model side and how tech is built and building alternative solutions, to public policy, to movement building. And I from my early days at Do Something, where it's all about young people and movement building, this in many ways is a full circle, because you can't, I believe, have even a solution that doesn't include some sort of will of the people. And so that's why I'm really excited that a lot of what we're doing now at Project Liberty is around movement building work. And I'll just end with one other thing, because also as I'm thinking about your question, Raphael, another quote comes to mind. I'm someone who absolutely loves quotes, because it's just also there's something, as Ra was talking about love, that had deep connection to me. In fact, I on my bag that I carry around with me every day, I got, how you can get kind of like your initials, the company will initial. I got the word love on it instead of my initials, just as a reminder. That's what it's all about at the end of the day. But at the same time, for me, with the love that Ra is talking about, the care that Jay has talked about, for me, there's some other piece of it that has created a lot of wisdom that I'm carrying with, that I'm still integrating and trying to figure out how it connects, which is another piece. And this is a quote from a Buddhist meditation teacher, also in the 80s, so that I'm bringing back to the 80s, named Chasagram Drungpa, who said these words that I find very interesting. He said, "The bad news is that you're falling through the air, nothing to hang on to, no parachute. The good news is there is no ground." What I love about that is this idea of kind of radical acceptance of that which is, and this illusion that we don't necessarily have full control. And within that creates this level of freedom. And freedom then opens the portal to that, which I was talking about before, which is when and if you do feel free, then what is possible? What is possible, and how do you make your decisions, and how do you shape your life? And it, again, goes to that full circle.
Oh, my goodness. I wish we could talk for another 20 years, as we hopefully will. I look forward to our next 20 years. To conclude, if we could imagine someone potentially listening to us now in the podcast, who is in their 2003 moment, and if we could talk back in time to us, to ourselves, to our younger selves, and in present time to those who may be listening who are in the beginning or the emerging parts of their own paths, from all that we've shared and what comes to mind, what might you offer or invite?
I've got three things that I would tell my 20-year-old self. The first is to slow down. The second is to stay curious. And the third is to prioritize relationships over results.
I'll add to that and just say, be more than do.
My word is allow. Allow more. Trust more. Listen more. Receive more. Honor more.
What's coming to me is very much personalizing it to our daughter Paloma, who's almost 17. And it's been really hard to be an adolescent in this period of time and all that we're facing. I think back to like my own experience as a kid with troubles of, my parents' relationship and finding wholeness. And I think where I'm landing is to welcome the beauty of the broken places. Face the broken places and say, thank you. I am you. I welcome you. I love you. Because inside the brokenness is the hidden wholeness. And I think a lot of what y'all have all shared is that we're letting go of premises and assumptions and fantasies of our own life and work and what's around us. And when we can sit with what is in its beautiful imperfection, I think you get to that kind of surrender, which is not a diminishing of, a lessening of, but a surrender that is expansive. A surrender that, exactly as you shared, opens up a deeper freedom.
There's a refrain in a song that I much prefer as a poem than a song, by a guy named Leonard Coen, and I think the name of the song is Anthem, and it's used in lots of spaces that I'm sure we're all in. But it reminds me of this sort of welcoming of the beauty of the broken places, and I think it goes something like this, which is, ring the bell that you can ring. There is no perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in.
May BBMG's legacy continue to ring loud in all of the places that you are finding yourself, all of the unusual places where you are finding yourself, that the light is meant to come through those doors, those portals, those windows, those cracks.
I keep on thinking, as you're talking about light and cracks, I keep on thinking about shards of glass. That's the image that's coming to mind, and how each of those little shards of glass have a little reflection. And so today, our conversation have little reflections that are that have, I think, shined into our own lives, into how we've intersected, and to who you are and what you, Raphael, have built in BBMG, in this belief, this deep possibility mindset of a better, more powerful, more equitable future. And that's the intersection of the place that you've been in, is really thinking about that possibility. And that's, again, reflected in us, in our journeys, in our relationships, but also just this kind of emanating out in these little shards of mirror and glass and reflections that have pieces, but are ultimately a whole. So thank you.
Thank you, Lara. I also just want to acknowledge that the whole premise of any of our work at BBMG is precisely community, love, and light, and the genuine calling of life. And that it is at its best and at its truest simply a vessel for our values, our creativity, our love, our passion, our commitment, and it's held by the whole. Every glorious team member at BBMG today, and who has ever walked through our lives, every client we've had the chance to know and learn with, and then every person whose path we've touched in whatever ways and been transformed ourselves by it. This is community above all. And so as we celebrate 20 and look forward to 20 more and many beyond, I'll hold each of you with such love, as close as ever, as you've always been, never more than literally a breath away. And may those who walk with us, and then hopefully in their own paths, as they embrace their own moments of obligation, may they have friends like you to pick them up when we fall, when we've lost our sense of self, to hold a mirror of our best, a shoulder to cry on, a hug when needed, high fives to celebrate, and whoop whoops to cheer. And I honestly believe, as I hope long in the future, but one never knows, as I draw toward a final breath, I will hold this moment close. And my family and my ancestors and our team and our clients and our partners and our communities, because that's wholeness for me. So just know how much I love you, how grateful I am and we are for your friendship and your wisdom and your love.
Love you. Thank you.
Yes, love you all. Take care.
Love you all.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much for listening to The Future We Want from BBMG. We've been speaking with Lara Galinsky, J. Coen Gilbert, and Lara Galinsky. And while Rod, Jay, and Lara had such kind things to say about our personal friendship and our work throughout the years, we would not be here without the incredible talent, creativity, love, care, and community of the whole BBMG team, which includes
Des Castillo,
Miriam Delo Jallo,
Sanjay Khanna,
Anna Kochman,
Chaying Lee,
Jen Louie,
Robin McCaffrey,
Elise Merriman,
Brian Miller,
Jess Patera,
Erica Pontes,
Brianna Quindazzi,
Amy Speck,
Hannah Thomas,
Annie Yang,
Amanda Yogendran,
Paul Zanelli,
and me, Liz Courtney, producer of The Future We Want.
Additional audio production and original music is by Go Destroy Art.
If you enjoyed this episode, we hope you'll subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
because there's more to come in season 3.
We'll be talking to other leaders who won't wait on issues that can't wait.
And sharing more stories from BBMG's 20 years in the biz.
See you in the future.